But look, it's great to see you. We've got a good 20 minutes that we can still have a good chat. So let's get going. Um, Sheridan, one of the things that you said particularly was that you've had really broad experience in terms of interviewing all these really interesting people. But one of the things that I wanted to hear from you was the more personal one, which you said that you had an interesting conversion story. And I thought that's really a great place to start. So let's start there.
Mm. Right. So my parents were members of what we would traditionally call one of the classic cults. My mum was a missionary in Peru with them. My dad was a pioneer in London and in the north of England. So like a local area missionary, if you like. And they were in it for like 30 and 40 years each. And over a period of about 10 years, they started to doubt what they'd been taught. And it all started kind of really when this particular organization, who are very well known for coming around and knocking on your door, who prophesied the end of the world in 1974. That didn't happen, and they prophesied it again in 1975. Still didn't happen, and that's when a lot of people started to doubt what they'd been told. But my parents were still in it, and they kind of just went through this 10-year period of doubt. Their marriage suffered as a result of that. My mum nearly had a breakdown as a result of that. But I was being raised during that time, and they were raising me for as best as they could. But always in the back of their mind, wondering that, if Armageddon comes, what's going to happen with Sheridan? Because there's no kind of sense of security of salvation or anything like that, even for them. Long story short, because this is a separate story all alone, but my mum ended up having a wonderful encounter with God through a local Baptist church. And, she'd been taught that every other church is from the devil, so you can't go to any other church. But this lady invited her to a kind of a ladies' coffee morning, and it wasn't going to be held in the church. It was going to be held in the fellowship hall next door. And so Mum thought, well, maybe that's one step removed. So she went along. And this lady apparently painted this beautiful picture and said, this is what life is like when God is in control of our lives. And then she took a paintbrush, dipped it in the black paint, and then destroyed it and said, this is what happens when we're in control of our lives. And then her final prayer, this visiting speaker, was something along the lines of, Lord, if there's any woman here struggling with her faith. And when you listen to the tape recording back, it's at that point you start hearing this wailing in the background. And that's my mother crying.
Wow.
And all these women come around her and are just kind of like the arms of God around her. And that moment she knew that she was home. But that had kind of come at the end of like a 2 or 3 year process of opening up a Good News Bible that she had gotten from World Expo 88. She shouldn't have received it, she shouldn't have accepted it, but she had it. The New World Translation, and I think a Catholic Douay version or something. And she would open that up for 2.5 years straight, praying, God, who is Jesus? Is he just an angel, as I've been taught, or is he actually God in the flesh? And she came to an answer on that from John 8:58, when Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, echoing Exodus 3, God saying, I am, this is my name. And then this experience happened afterwards. We saw that change. I was trying to find my life in nightclubs during that time, trying to kind of find my sense of significance and security in being a nightclub DJ, starting to get some success, starting to win some competitions in Queensland, see the change in Mum. The competitions aren't making me feel any better. That ultimately led to me making a commitment, and then finally kind of, finding my path.
We always underestimate the importance of people being able to kind of just share the gospel so simply. That sometimes what people need is just really a very simple explanation that life can be different with God than what the fear and the worry that they had outside of that process.
There probably weren't a lot of highfalutin theologians, running around in Mum and Dad's life at that stage, but they remember calling, because when they were, knocking on doors and things, I remember calling on one family, and the lady said, "Yeah, I'm going to be praying for you, See, a lot of Christians just turn Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of Christians just turn the Jehovah's Witnesses away, or tell them they're wrong, or whatever. And actually, what really made the best impression was actually Christians who showed them love in some kind of way. And years later, when Mum and Dad had come through fully to understand who Jesus was, came fully into the faith, they met this woman again, and the woman said, "You know what? I've never stopped praying for you." I think it was about 15 years.
One of the things that you keep saying in all your books and even your blogs and things that I've been reading is about communicating the gospel, communicating Christianity to the world. And a lot of what your work has been is communicating it to the secular world. I mean, to those who would often reject it. I mean, we often say nasty things about the media. I mean, we often say, oh, the media is anti-Christian and all that kind of thing. But part of it is not just their fault. It's also our fault in the sense of our needing to communicate the gospel and communicating Christianity to it. What have you learned about that that can help us to do that better?
Yeah, gosh, that's a huge topic and a PhD in it, I'm sure. It's a great question though, because we need to be asking that. We so need to be asking that. I think so often we expect people to understand our language, and that we expect that they should be asking the questions we want them to be asking. And so, how I would long for people to come up to me in the street or at the BBC or somewhere else and cry out as they did to the apostles in Acts, "Brothers, what must we do to be saved?" Now, I don't know about you, Martin, but I haven't had anybody come up and ask that question.
Not
We'd
quite like
like
that,
them
no.
to, but they're not. What is the culture? How are the culture showing their longing for God and their separation from God because they're living their own world, living in the kingdom of darkness rather than coming into the bright, flourishing kingdom of light? It'll be through sense of meaninglessness and purposelessness, the deaths of despair that so many people are talking about right now, deep depression, anxiety, all of those kinds of things. It'll be through a sense of complete hopelessness that there is nothing else, and a sense of what we would call works righteousness, which ultimately is actually, I'm going to try and do as much as I possibly can with the personal development courses and the self-help books to get as better as I can. Now, actually, that's kind of a secular version of working my way to godliness. So we've got to look at what the signs are actually of people hungering for the gospel, and then we've got to speak to it to the world in language that they understand. And also, an important part of this, Martin, also is recognizing that sometimes it takes a little while. And so when I go into the BBC or something, um, my old fundamentalist self would have listened to some of the messages that I give now and say, "Oh, well, he's not giving the gospel." Because what I would have expected then is that I had to give the full gospel and go into the whole, story uh, of humankind's separation from God, and then Jesus coming in the flesh, and then him dying and dying for our sins and rising to new life. You'd have to give it all. What I've learned is that for a start, that comes across as preachy to the secular mind, and the producers tell me, they say, "Look, be religious. It's a religious spot that you do, but don't be preachy." And by preachy, they mean don't expect that we, number one, agree with you, and don't expect, number two, that by repeating something lots and lots of times that somehow we're going to get it. Repetition for emphasis, which us preachers love to do, that comes across as preachy. What do? I start with one little entry point. That's all I do. And I try to get interest and be part of God's work in arousing interest in the gospel, by just telling a little story of how maybe God worked in somebody's life, or pointing to the creation, Romans 1:20, and saying, is there something in this experience that we have of being overwhelmed by nature that maybe points to something that, St. Paul, all those years ago saw, that somehow it reflects the nature and the goodness and the power and the beauty of God. So I think that's a starting point, and testimonies. My father is battling pancreatic cancer,
Oh,
and one of the great gifts of that moment has been that we have had a guy named Helmut come into our life. Helmut is a part of my parents' church, and he walked up to us. I was visiting one time, and he walked up and he said, "Oh, I hear that your parents are in need, and I've got some ideas." In fact, you'll find this in the book, in Reflect with Sheridan, you'll find it. It's called Through a Truck Driver's Hands. And in the end, Helmut has been this person who has rallied around support for my parents, who has organized cooking rosters, who has taken Dad to chemotherapy there and back every week, has done so much. I went and shared that story on Radio 2. Radio 2 here in the United Kingdom is like 12 million listeners per week. It's the largest radio network here in the UK. I went and shared that on air. I came out of the studio into the producer studio. There's maybe 5 producers there, and they were all gobsmacked. And they all said, "You mean people like that exist?" And so there is something about giving testimonies of God at work through others that can raise that awareness and say, "Hang on, what is all that about?" Well, life of God has come to live and reside in that person. And that's part of the good news. The part of that good news is the fact that that's an offer that's available to all of us. And the good news is that, Jesus lived a profound life, and he died at our hands, and he rose again. And I believe that literally, friend. I really do. Maybe you don't yet, but I believe that literally. And now he's remaking this world. And that's all part of the good news. And I opted into that a few years ago, and you can too.
The problem, I suppose, is I was speaking to a young guy the other day, and he quoted me something that someone had said, which was, the world likes the product, they just don't like the shop selling it. And I think that there's something about that in terms of what the church has gone through in particularly the last 20 years, in terms of things like the Royal Commission and all those kind of things, where people kind of are looking very skeptically at the church. And I think they, in some ways, have always been open to the gospel, but the gospel comes in the package of the church. So how do we deal with that?
You're absolutely right. And you're right on both fronts, Martin. Whenever I fly back to Australia, I, within a day, find myself sitting and talking to somebody about spiritual things. And normally it's because they're kind of reading Deepak Chopra books or whatever. They're kind of general new agey level. And so we're talking about things like that. I don't have those conversations here in the United Kingdom. It's a different climate, and it's still there in Australia. So make use of that. But in terms of the public perception, the Royal Commission has been horrendously damaging. And not just that, recently, to see the number of Christians that have kind of embraced conspiracy theories about the coronavirus. And, that somehow, Bill Gates is going to inject us with microchips, and, it's all going to be connected to 5G towers. We had a little bit of that followed here, but nowhere near to the degree that I saw that being followed in Australia and the United States. There is just something about our psyche that somehow makes us open to that. So that has been, I think, very, very negative against us. Certainly here in the United Kingdom, we sometimes get a negative runoff from evangelical support of Trump in the United States. And so that's kind of colored the word evangelical. I very much say that I'm an evangelical in terms of what it actually means. We're people of the good news who hold to Scripture as the most authoritative source of information that we have, and all of the other things that are all part of what being an evangelical is. But unfortunately, it's been politicized, and that's kind of slipped over a little bit over into Australia as well. How do we combat that? Number one, I think we should do as much as we can to support the public Christians that Australia has. So people like Tim Costello, people like John Dixon. I'm just trying to think, her surname's Moore, also part of the Centre for Public Christianity. They have been working very hard to be a missional presence in the mainstream media for a good 10, 15 years now. And so we should be supporting them as much as they can. What's the difference between them and, say, another Christian group that, is kind of banging on about Christian rights, for instance? And there's a role for that. But the work that CPX do is to not come at it from a position of authority and really you need to line up with Christian values, nation. No, it says we are missionaries to this nation. And so that means that we're going to listen to you first. We're going to hear what your longings are, what your stories are, what your complaints are, and we will deal with them honestly. And that's what we tried to do with the open house show when I was still in Sydney and we were broadcasting that on Hope 103.2 and stations around Australia. We were trying to take our critics seriously, which kind of it dealt with the truth matter. Is there truth in the Royal Commission? There is. Okay, we have got to face this. This is what being people of faith is. And it also could help to take the sting and the fuel away from the fire. If we just don't deal with it, if we don't address it, then we're just seen to be covering up, and that doesn't help the gospel one bit.
You mentioned open house. Now, you've written actually reflections on a number of the interviews that you did while you were doing open house. And I suppose the question I want to ask you is, what was the most memorable interviewee that you had, and what did you learn from them?
I've been asked that question many times, and I've never been able to come to a satisfactory answer. Because, I mean, there's 2,000 odd interviews over the span of, a couple of decades. And those are prepared interviews, let alone the ones that just happen spontaneously that I don't have some sort of written sheet for. There are always people who got you thinking, even if you didn't agree with them. So Tony Campolo was somebody like that, with whom I would disagree on some things, but with whom he completely changed my point of view on other things. There would be some people that you would have on, and they may not be big names, but they were still really quite profound. Now, there's one guy, his book is just on my shelf. Oh, look, I've just forgotten his name. But he's a musical theologian. And so he takes the language of music and uses that as a language in which to communicate the things of God. And so we set him up in the studio with a keyboard, and we got him to play the gospel. Now, this wasn't playing songs about the gospel. This was using music as a language to do it. And so he would use things like, remember that song with Cliff Richard some years ago, Whenever God Shines His Light on Me. And he would, start off and saying, look, this is the gospel. It starts off very calm. And then he says, when we keep on going a little bit further, then you'll find that it starts to get into rocky waters. And so then this kind of pre-chorus starts. And then you go back to the chorus, and after the chorus, it gets all nice and lovely. He said, well, that's the gospel. It's order, disorder, and then order again. It's the peace that was part of a relationship with God in the first place, the disorder that comes from breaking relationship with God, and then the peace that comes after Jesus comes and sorts it all out. So he was doing things like that. He would play Amazing Grace in all these different genres. So he'd play it in kind of honky-tonk and in kind of cheesy lounge room music that you might hear in the background while you're having breakfast at a hotel, that Muzak type. And he'd do it in hip-hop. And he'd say, this is the thing, is that the gospel is the same, but it can take all these lovely different expressions. So that was wonderful. I'm sorry I can't remember his name, and I can't see his book spine here from this distance, but that was really interesting. Look, and there's so many, Johnny Erickson Tada, and so many people. Richard Foster was somebody who took me years to get an interview with Richard Foster. Some people may know his book, Celebration of Discipline. He's written so many. Here's a funny story. When I first approached Richard Foster for an interview, many years before I got one, his long-serving PA said, thank you for your inquiry. Actually, Richard's clearness committee has met, and they've discerned that Richard is not to do any media for the next 12 months. And Richard Foster, an evangelical Quaker, and he had this group of people that would meet, and they would discern with him before God what his schedule should be every 12 months. And he ran with that. And I thought, well, you know what? I can't argue with that answer. But when I did get the interview with him, it was wonderful. He was a wonderful saint of God that I kind of expected.
It sounds like you've had a very, very varied kind of connection with a lot of these different people. And I think a lot of it's actually in your new book in terms of Reflect with Sheridan, because I've only had it for a few days. as I've read through a number of them, the one thing that comes up more and more is your enjoyment of story, both telling your own personal stories, but then also sharing the stories of others. Can you just reflect on that for me in terms of the writing of the book?
Yeah, gosh, you're asking some great questions, Martin. These are all the topics I love to talk about. Story is so powerful. Story is the language of humanity. We may have inherited from the Greeks and the Romans a sense of ordered, principled thinking, bullet points, which are great. They're really good for clarifying truth, clarifying values, getting things nice and neat and tight. But the language that is across all cultures throughout history is story. So we are wired for story. And when you hear somebody tell a story well told, you find yourself entering in, and you find yourself also maybe taking part in that story imaginatively and saying, well, which role am I? Am I the protagonist? Am I the antagonist? Am I just a kind of a figure in the crowd, in the background? What am I? So there is something powerful about stories, which is why I believe that Jesus used them so much in his parables. And one thing, Martin, I think would be wonderful if we could somehow revive the lost art of parable telling, because if we could do it in the way that Jesus did, which always brought some sort of response, either people didn't get it, and then they said, what does it mean? Which means that he brought them a step closer to actually entering the kingdom of God, because what does it mean? Or they did understand and recognize that they're in there, and yet it's done in such a subtle way. It's a very, very clever way of talking about the things of God to the world. So I've kind of became a real convert to story some years ago with the first book I wrote called Unseen Footprints. And I found that if you could tell it right, and you could keep the pace there and keep the interest there, you could even pause a story and go into something else and maybe do another chapter on something else, and then pick up the story another chapter or two down the line, and people would still be with you because they're interested to know how it ends. Again, the story really encapsulates the gospel. It encapsulates this whole idea of what the universe and the cosmos is all about. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and in the middle there's all kinds of conflict and all kinds of challenges. The best stories have conflict. If you are reading a story and you're getting bored, it's probably because there's no challenge, no conflict for the protagonist to face. That's the gospel. And yet there is some sort of resolution that happens. The character goes through some sort of challenge, and they may not even win in the end, but they are changed in terms of their character. If they're changed in a good way, we call it a transformation story. And isn't that an ultimate echo of what the gospel is about? It comes to transform and change us. If they change in a bad way, if they don't change at all, then, we call it a tragedy. So either way, it's showing us, what values are. So very much for Reflect with Sheridan is very much based on stories, because I find they're the best way to communicate and to connect. And then you can bring the principle in there, but you can kind of do it in a way that teases, not in a negative sense, but in a way that kind of says, there's something in here. I think it's got something to do with this. Let's keep on going with the story and see if it's true.
I suppose, essentially, we're about to enter into a period of the ultimate story, in terms of the coming of Christ in Bethlehem, and I suppose again that story having lots of drama in it, depending on the way in which, in fact, both Gospels telling it, they tell it with great drama, whether it be for the shepherds or the Magi. But again, it's the story that actually draws us into what we're actually talking about, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. Gospel writers are absolutely genius at this. And this is why I believe in the inspiration of Scripture, because these were really ordinary guys. And God's Spirit was using them to encapsulate this story. And again, the postmodernists, will love it, because the fact we've also got the different viewpoints to make sure that, we don't just have, one authority. We've got a whole bunch of viewpoints that actually say, well, I was looking at it from this angle, and yes, that's exactly what happened. And this, and somebody else will look at it from that angle and say, yes, and I saw this little detail that maybe you missed. It's amazing. And we've got all the characters. We've got the drama, the crucifixion itself. We've got everything leading up to that. We've got the Gethsemane scene. We've got the scene where Peter is tempted to deny Jesus, and we see, is he going to do it? Is he going to do it? And then the cock crows 3 times. And then we have after that with the resurrection appearances, which are some of the most amazing experiences to be sharing, I think, actually with the secular world. I love the story of Cleopas and his friend walking along to Emmaus, and they're talking and they're downhearted about everything. Everything has gone so wrong. The world is upside down, and all that we had placed our hope in is gone. Now, does that itself not resonate in many ways with our own experiences, that all we've placed our hopes in have failed us in some kind of way? It might have been this political leader, or it might have been this ideology, or it might have been just these little plans that I had for Christmas and they've been upended by COVID or something. And then this mysterious third person comes and joins them. And what does he do? He asks questions. What are you talking about? Haven't you read in the scriptures this little bit here? And then they invite him in for dinner at the end. And as they're eating together, as they're in community together, as they're experiencing hospitality together, their eyes are opened. Don't we need our eyes opened to see the great things that are going on that we can't see without our spiritual eyes opened? Augustine famously said, our chief end is to heal the eyes of the heart so that God is seen. And that's, I think, a great calling for us to do. So all of those stories around the Christmas story are just profound. And I know I've wandered into Easter there, but all of those stories around Christmas and what we now celebrate as Easter.
That's exactly what you're saying. It might be another chapter, but it's still the same story. Right. And I think I love that story of the road to Emmaus as well, because I find the humor in it, particularly where it tells us that Jesus was he made out that he was going to keep going, so he kind of gave them an opportunity to say no, come. It's like when you want someone to invite you for dinner, but you don't want to say that because that seems impolite. And so you say, oh, look, it's time for dinner. I think I'm going to go. And you're kind of waiting for them to say, oh, yes, it is almost dinner time. Why don't you come? Why don't you stay? So it's just wonderfully, there's a sense of the wonderful humanity and humor of Christ in that moment as well, which is such an important moment and yet such a wonderful. And I think what I like about your book is the humor that you've put into it, and in fact the passion that you've just demonstrated tonight. That passion and that humor, I think I found in even the little bits that I've read already, and I think that's the thing that for me is so important in terms of gospel, is that often, yes, it is serious, but the thing is that so often we've made it so serious that we've taken all the joy out of it. We've taken all that sense of the humor, the wondrousness. I mean, saying that we need to take the speck out of your eye, we're trying to take the speck out of somebody else and forgetting the beam that's in yours. I mean, come on, that's innately very funny. Right. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom. I mean, that's funny. Yeah. And it was meant to be.
The crowd would have been laughing. You're absolutely right. The crowd would have been laughing.
So if you're not laughing while you're actually sharing the gospel, if the people aren't laughing while you're sharing the gospel, then you're doing it wrong. Then it needs to be part of that. Anyway, I think that's
good point.
And so I think I found that in your book, and I really appreciate it. I want to finish tonight with one last thing, and that's actually not about you at all. It's actually about Merrin.
Mm.
Now, I believe you said that Merrin's a statistician. But has been working for the Oxford group, who's been working on the vaccine.
She is the senior statistician on that whole project. So when the news came out, that it's 70% effective, but 90% if they do a tweak with the dosage, that's all her figures. And in fact, the big paper that came out, which I don't know if it would have made the media probably in Australia as well. Yes. So that's all her work. I mean, it's quite astounding actually that a statistician would be lead author on that paper. And for anybody who doesn't know this world, I don't, but I do now. The Lancet is one of the 2 best medical journals in the world. It's one of those things where if you are published once in your life in the Lancet, you've made it. I think Merrin's now published about 3 times, and this is as lead author, which is
Fantastic.
unheard of for a statistician to actually be lead author on something. So it's amazing. And if anybody reads another book of mine called Resurrection Year, that's all our story of leaving Sydney and then coming to the UK because we couldn't have children. We were coming over here. Merryn took up the role that she was offered here at Oxford. That led to her slowly being discipled, trained, nurtured in this field. She then focused more and more on vaccine development. And then she finds herself in this key role for a vaccine that is going to be touching the world. We can't help but look at that now. And this is really something that's only happened in the last few weeks and kind of go, that puts that decision and that challenging decision. I mean, this relates to some of the darkest moments in our life, but it puts those decisions back in late 2010, early 2011 into perspective, into a sense of providence.
Wow.
That maybe, God was bringing Merryn here for such a time as this. It's profound.
Isn't that amazing? Well, and also that she's made herself available for that, which is the other thing, because it's the combination, isn't it, between God's provision and our decision actually coming together. And obviously she's put that together. And so from my perspective, and I think my congregation's perspective too, is to please convey our love and our thanks to Merryn and the team, because I'm sure that's many hours of sleepless nights to actually put that together. And so look, it could be the very thing that could transform the way in which we kind of deal with this virus. So please do convey our thoughts and our thanks to her in terms of the midst of that.
I will. Thank
Sheridan, we didn't quite have as much time as we thought, but we've done well nonetheless. But the thing with it is, thank you very much for sharing with us and for continuing to share in writing. And I'm encouraging the congregation that if they want to get your book, they can just contact the church office, and we'll put them together with where they can get it, and we can make sure that happens. And we'll also give them access to the website and so on too. And of course, our little interview now will also be up on YouTube, so we can continue to share that with those who weren't able to get to us this Saturday night. So Sheridan, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know it's been a busy and difficult time for you guys, and in fact still continues to be a difficult time in England. I mean, for Australia, we have a very different perspective on this whole thing because of just the way in which the trajectory of this disease has gone in Australia has been so different to so many other places in the world. So thank you very much for your time and being with us tonight. We really appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, and my apologies again for being late.
Not
Terrible.
at all.
Unforgivable.
Well, it's forgivable. Everything is forgivable. That's for sure. If God can do it, we can certainly do it as well. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.